Hello, I'm Aidan Dodson, Honorary Professor of Egyptology at the University of Bristol, and I'm going to be talking about my work on the first pharaohs and the book that has recently spawned. What we're talking about when we deal with the first pharaohs are those of the first three dynasties. Ancient Egyptian history was divided into a series of dynasties by a Hellenistic historian called Manetho, and the first three of those are very much the formative periods of Egyptian history. And if we look at this time bar running from prehistory, going back before 5000 BC, through to the end of what you might call ancient Egypt in the early centuries AD, we are looking at this point here, around about 3000 BC, going on for a few centuries after that. And the key event around this is the unification of Egypt around about 3000 BC, give or take a century. This far back in time, there's a certain amount of debate still going on as to exactly how the chronology quite works. We can actually trace monumental Egypt back as far as 5000 BC, when at Nabta Playa, here in the desert to the west of Abu Simbel, we have an alignment of stones which almost looks like a miniature Stonehenge. Like Stonehenge, its exact purpose is unclear, and it's been moved from the Western Desert to the gardens of the Nubian Museum of Aswan, but probably some kind of astronomical thing is probably the best thing one can probably say about it. This, say, marks an early part of the pre-dynastic period, which is effectively the Egyptian Neolithic and Chalcolithic. And it's during this time that agriculture and settlements really get going in Egypt, along with pottery production and various other craft specializations. And here we've just got a couple of different sets of wares from upper or southern Egypt during the pre-dynastic period, including the very typical black-topped red ware at the top there, and then slightly later decorated ware. The place where we can probably start seeing a proto-state coming together is at Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt. Here we find some of the earliest graves which are clearly socially separated from everything else, from everybody else. During much of the earlier pre-dynastic, most graves seem to be much of a muchness, but here at Hierakonpolis, in a couple of centuries prior to 3000 BC, we are finding large tombs like this one. All that survives is the cuttings in the desert gravel, with the central area here for the burial, and all these post holes for the superstructure. All completely destroyed now, of course, but there seems to be a lot about the form of this tomb, which presages things in brick and stone a little bit later on. We also find around this time the painted tomb, the first decorated tomb in Egypt, which although slightly problematic in many ways, probably is to represent the tomb of a ruler again of this area around Hierakonpolis, which is where we say we seem to start seeing various villages and towns coalescing into some kind of proto-state. Also around this time, we're getting more spectacular craft work carried out. For example, these colossal statues of the fertility god Min, found at Coptos, which again, similar sort of date probably, although they do actually bear the names, probably secondarily, of kings following the unification. And also seeing what else is around at this time in the north, which is rather less well known archaeologically than the south, but it's getting more so from Tel Facher here. We have this rather nice little miniature figure of a man with a gilded t-shirt, effectively. Another site where we're finding the coming together of the southern Egyptian state, anyway, is Abydos. Here, at this site, particularly El Gab, in one of the more remote parts of the site, we find tombs during the latter part of the pre-dynastic, and then they continue on into the dynastic period after the unification of Egypt around about 3000. And amongst these pre-dynastic tombs is this one, UJ, in many ways typical of later tombs at the site as well, a cutting in the desert gravel, subdivided by brick walls to make up chambers. Some early proto-hieroglyphs were found in this tomb, suggesting that the owner might have been a king who was known as Scorpion. Whether it's the same Scorpion who is known a bit later on is unclear. Another piece of sort of artwork we find during the late pre-dynastic are these palettes in siltstone, decorated with motifs which are very similar to some which are found in Mesopotamia at the same sort of time. They seem to be to do with hunting and also fantastic animals here. Also, however, you've got clearly warfare being shown on this one. This bull goring an enemy is probably the king. Later on, the king is represented by a bull. And here we've got this knife handle, very similar kind of art with the so-called Beastmaster motif, which is to be found in Mesopotamia at the same sort of time. So it's unclear quite how the dynamic is working between Egypt and Mesopotamia at this time, but both areas which are developing writing, the state, and there's clearly quite a bit of to and fro between the two, but exactly what that means, whether it's simply an awareness of what's going on over in the next river valley, or whether or not there is some kind of greater movement of individuals, remains a matter for debate. Also from Hierakonpolis is the first example of what you might call classical Egyptian art, in the sense of the way that the human figure is depicted. And this will carry on right the way through into Roman times. Here, a king named Scorpion, whether it's the same Scorpion of tomb UJ at El Gab remains a matter of debate, is shown cutting the first part of an irrigation ditch. And it's thought that the need to coordinate matters to do with irrigation around the annual Nile flood may have been an incentive to start creating larger groupings and simply small groups of local villages. Also, one of the earliest examples of classical Egyptian art is the Narmer palette, again from Hierakonpolis, which is already a crucial site for the formation of the Egyptian state. Here, the king is shown smiting an enemy in a pose which continues to be used right the way through to Roman times. You have Roman emperors being shown like this. He's wearing the white crown, later symbolic of southern Egypt. And over here, he's wearing the red crown, which is later on symbolic of Lower Egypt. And the whole thing has been interpreted as being the conquest of the north by the south. Particularly as this little rebus here shows Horus, the divine embodiment of kingship, leading by the nose a proto-hieroglyph which seems to represent the south, the marshlands of the delta in the north of Egypt. So all of this taken together, and here's the bull again, the king with goring an enemy and knocking down a fortress. All of this is tying in with the idea that we have got, this is a commemoration of the unification of Egypt. And certainly Narmer, the king who is represented here, his name is up here, is amongst the very earliest kings who we have any real evidence for. And this includes his tomb here at El Gab, which is the site we were just talking about, where we have the early the pre-dynastic burials here, including UJ, the tomb of Scorpion, and then it moves on southwards to tombs dating to the first and second dynasties. These tombs are linked not only to the burial places, but also they have about 1.5 kilometers away a series of monumental brick enclosures. One of which is a pretty good but not exact one-for-one correlation between these and the tombs up until Mel Garb, and certainly at the earliest examples of enclosures here are those belonging to Hor-Aha, the second king of the first dynasty, with a recently discovered traces up here, probably belonging to the enclosure of Narmer. What's interesting about these enclosures is that they only functioned for a brief period of time before being dismantled. It looks as though they probably served for the major funerary ceremonies of a king, and then they were dismantled, and another one was built for the next king. So only one of them remains standing today. This one, which belongs to the last king to be buried at Abydos during the early dynastic period, the Shunet Zabib of King Khasekhemwy. And here we can see with the walls still standing 30 meters high, mud brick, with this paneled facade, which again is a motif also found at Mesopotamia around the same sort of time. These are plans of the tombs of the kings of the first dynasty, and they move from a quite small example of Narmer up here through to this one of Aha, and then they become more and more elaborate, with entrance stairways added in the reign of Den, which this one belongs to, and running on through to the end of the dynasty, where we have quite a sophisticated design of tomb, which heralds things we find later on. And here we've just got a few photographs of some of those tombs, starting off very, very small, Narmer's example here, then getting more and more elaborate until we get to Ka'az down here, which even has sliding portcullises blocking the route down to the burial chamber. The earlier tombs, however, had no means of entry after the roof had been put on. This is a model in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, which shows the construction of the tomb of Jet. And here we can see that it's cutting in desert gravel with these brick walls to form chambers, and then the burial chamber itself lined with wood and then roofed with wood, which must have come from the Lebanon, because we don't get big enough trees growing in Egypt to be able to span that sort of gap. And as I say, no stairway or anything, so it would not be possible to finish the tomb and put a superstructure, which we think is probably just a tumulus of gravel. Nothing survives, unfortunately, until after the king had been buried. This probably wasn't the ideal solution, and hence we find the addition of stairways in the reign following the reign of Jet. On the eastern side, there were a pair of stelae outside these tombs, which seem to have been the long-term offering place for the king's spirit. So we seem to have that the main ceremonies are carried out at the enclosures, but then once those enclosures have gone out of use and have been dismantled, we have the cult is purely carried out here. The tombs, of course, were all badly robbed in antiquity, but various things were recovered during the various excavations which have been carried out there, including the two labels at the top here, dating the reign of Den. The left-hand one commemorates a military campaign into Syria-Palestine, and once again shows that icon of the king smiting an enemy, which we saw in the Narmer palette. And the other one, the one on the right, commemorates the king's jubilee or Hebsed ceremony, which, at least from later evidence, took place after a king had been on the throne for 30 years. The hieroglyphs on here are all recognizable as hieroglyphs which have continued to be used down into Roman times, although at this point we haven't got connected sentences, we've simply got names and odd little phrases. Another example of the continuity of Egyptian religion at the bottom there is we have the Apis bull here, taking part with the king in a ceremony known as the running of the Apis, and the Apis bull continues to be worshipped as an avatar of the god Ptah of Memphis right into Roman times. So once again, although this stuff is primitive by later standards, it's where we find the origins of an awful lot of what goes on in Egypt later on. These are some of the stelae which were found at these tombs. So there's normally a pair of them. They bear the king's Horus name, one of the 5 names of the king in later times anyway, surmounted by the figure of Horus and the king and say the name. And they all follow the same basic pattern. The unusual one is this one. It bears a name, but it's that of a woman, Mer-Neet. And also it doesn't have a Horus, so it's not a Horus name. What we discover from other sources is that Mer-Neet was a royal mother who seems to have acted as regent during the minority of her son Den. And as a result, she is buried like a king. The tomb is almost indistinguishable from a contemporary king's tomb. And the stelae likewise, apart from the fact she doesn't have any title on these. Another feature of these early tombs at El Gab is human sacrifice, and that reaches a peak during the reign of Djoser, when we have over 700 of these burials. We know they're sacrifices because the architecture of the graves is such that you couldn't individually roof a grave over. They all had to be done in one fell swoop. This kind of mass sacrifice is also found in Mesopotamia a couple of centuries later in the death pits of Ur. And this kind of ability to take huge numbers of other human beings with you to the grave seems to mark early phase of the development of divine kingship. It then rapidly drops off. And after the climax of Djoser, the numbers fall with every single subsequent royal burial until the whole idea disappears at the end of the second dynasty. These people in these graves were members of the royal household, including some women, and the stela I show there is one from a female tomb. As far as what's going on outside Egypt, we have certainly material relating to trade into Syria, Palestine and beyond, but also we have evidence for military activity, at least both in the north, we saw that label earlier on, but also into the south, into Nubia, which later becomes an Egyptian colony. And at Jebel Sheikh Suleiman, we have this relief which appears to commemorate a military campaign by King Djoser. Although the burials of the kings remained in the south, you can see continuing ancestral cemeteries going back into the pre-dynastic. An administrative capital was established in the north, which is later known as Memphis. This is the place from which Egypt can best be ruled. And really, Memphis was the admin capital of Egypt for most of its history. There are royal residences elsewhere and religious capitals, but the actual place where the main bureaucracy was based seems to be Memphis. And this is established early on in the first dynasty. Tradition has it under Hor-Aha, but may well have been begun as soon as the unification process was complete. On a ridge overlooking Memphis, and it's basically the other side of the ridge on the top photograph and to the right on the bottom photograph, this is where the high officials of the newly united state were buried, all the way along this, at the top of this ridge, where the tombs, which were quite substantial and probably had whitewashed facades, could be seen from downtown Memphis, and also the spirits of the dead could look down onto the city where they lived and worked. And here we can, looking north, we can see the later pyramids at Abu Sir and the great pyramids at Giza in the distance. And here's a map of Saqqara showing the location of these tombs along this ridge. Downtown Memphis is down here. And later, as these choice sites got filled up, the sites spread down the hill, the slope here. And this is from that other side, that slope. So here is where first dynasty tombs at the beginning, and later ones coming down the slope here. So no kings were buried at Abydos in the first dynasty, in spite of what some 1950s scholars thought. And it's only in the beginning of the second dynasty that quite a long way from this necropolis down here that we find the first royal tombs at Saqqara, which later becomes a very important place for royal burial. And that transition to Saqqara for royal burial takes place at the beginning of the second dynasty, and we know that the sequence of the first three kings quite neatly from this statue of a priest named Hetep-Dief, who lists the first kings, Hetep-Sekhemwy, Reyneb, and Ninetcha next to each other here. These tombs are rather different from the examples at Abydos. First of all, they are partly rock cut, which is possible for geology at Saqqara, which isn't possible at Abydos. And here we can just see the entrance passage going down into the rock here. And here is part of the interior, which has become exposed to the outside world. Unfortunately, we know nothing about the superstructure of this tomb, because this pyramid was built a few centuries later on top of it and completely obliterated any superstructure which was there. However, one feature is this trench which has been cut across the plateau here, and this seems to be designed to create a separate royal burial precinct here, separated off from everything else. The tomb of Reyneb, the second king of the dynasty, has not yet been identified, but it must have been somewhere in this area because one of his funerary stelae was purchased nearby. It's been reused in one of the local villages. And then the third king, buried close by to Hetep-Sekhemwy, in a slightly more rough and ready looking tomb as far as its layout is concerned, but basically the same basic concept, is Ninetcha, the third king of the dynasty, who is also the first king for whom we have three-dimensional representation. So this is a statue of him, rather crude, now in the Rijksmuseum van Oudheden in Leiden, showing him wearing Jubilee dress, which would suggest a reign of at least 30 years for him. And indeed, his reign seems to be one of the longer ones of the period. Then after him, it all gets a little bit problematic. We only have only a couple of more royal tombs actually identified, and as we'll see shortly, the identification of how many kings of the dynasty remains somewhat problematic. We know that there were tombs of two kings, Sened and Peribsen, somewhere in Egypt, because Sherry, the owner of this false door stealer, was a priest of their cult. Where Sened's tomb is a bit of a problem, because Peribsen was buried at Abydos, where there is absolutely no sign of his tomb or apparently any space for his tomb. Sened, so where was Sened buried? Well, Saqqara possibly, like Sherry, but it seems strange that Sherry should be a priest of two kings buried in different parts of the country. So this all remains a bit of a mystery of exactly where Sened is buried. But so we certainly have a tomb of Peribsen at Abydos, so he's gone back to the south again. And a number of features of his time suggests something odd is going on, particularly the fact that his stele, both of which survive, one's in Cairo, one's in London, had at the top of them not the Horus falcon, which all previous kings' funerary stele had, but the figure of a god called Set, a strange quadruped. Here he is. Exactly what animal he represented remains unclear. But the important point is that in later Egyptian myth, Horus and Set were mortal enemies who fought a number of battles, Set having murdered Horus's father and various other things. So what quite is going on here? Also, it's worth noting that the figure of Set, the Set figure here, has been erased. Well, the possibility has been suggested that there was some kind of civil war which went on in the latter part of the Second Dynasty, explaining why there's not too much data from it, and that the protagonists respectively followed Set and Horus, and that it was as a result of this real war that the later mythological situation between Horus and Set comes about. One has to be very careful with making that those sorts of ideas, but it's certainly a very interesting one, and certainly the later accounts of the battles between Horus and Set do sort of have a vague whiff of having been based on something real. That something certainly strange is going on is shown by the surviving king lists, which were written down centuries afterwards. But when we look at the three surviving examples, we find there is a huge gap in one of them. Basically jump from Sened to the last king of the dynasty, when we know there are other people. The other two lists have three royal names in there, but one of those names isn't actually a name at all. It's really an annotation in some source document of missing information, which has then accidentally been turned into a royal name during the process of editing these things, because these lists the lists we've got at the moment date to 1,000 years after the events. We have evidence that they started coming into existence much earlier, but clearly things have been edited, people have been trying to do research, so therefore we are not quite sure how many kings actually belong in this whole here, whether so you've got two names which are broadly consistent between these, but how many were concealed in King Lacuna or missing information, we simply don't know. But I think it seems reasonably clear that this is a period of civil war or other civil difficulties. And this is one of these later mythological texts I was talking about, Edfu, dated in the 1st century BC, and this has been suggested as being ultimately founded on a real story of a real civil war of the late Second Dynasty. There is contemporary evidence of conflict. For example, this jar from Hierakonpolis belongs to Karsekhem, the last king of the Second Dynasty, and this is to do with capture of foes, of northern foes particularly, suggesting that there's a renewal of conflict between the north and south. Some unresolved issues from the Unification, possibly. And on the left hand of this statue, both of which belong to Karsekhem, there is a notation of various people being killed in wars in the north. So all of this does suggest that there is a civil war, kicks off sometime, possibly after Sened, and then is brought to a close by Karsekhem. But exactly how long that war lasted and how many different factions were fighting, we simply just don't know at the moment. That Karsekhem wasn't sure that he would ever reunite the country, suggested by the fact there is this great brick enclosure at Hierakonpolis, which looks very much like the funerary enclosures we find at Abydos, so possibly he was thinking he might have to be buried there. But also his quite long residence there is suggested by the fact he builds the foundations for what later becomes the temple at Hierakonpolis, which goes on for millennia afterwards. And there's this door jamb, for example, of him, one of the earliest examples of an inscribed piece of building masonry. This clearly dates after he finally wins a civil war, however, because the Serech on the end here actually has both Horus and Set on top. It's absolutely unique. No other king ever has a combined Horus and Set, and Set is never used again. And also his name is slightly different. Rather than Karsekhem, which means the appearance of power, it reads Karsekhemwi, which means the appearance of two powers. And also he adds the epithet, the two lords are at peace in him. So it all looks very much like that Karsekhemwi won the civil war, but rather than death and destruction to the enemies, reconciliation was what he wanted to, how he went ahead, and therefore this combination of Horus and Set is uniquely found under him. He is ultimately buried at Abydos, with the most southernmost of all the tombs there, and also has the one still standing funerary enclosure. Here is his tomb. Once again, the geology means it's mud brick in a cutting in desert gravel, but has something in common in its overall plan with the Saqqara cut tunneled tombs. And there's one of his funerary stelae, again with the horse and set animal on top of his sireh. And his funerary enclosure, definitive one, at Abydos. Also datable to his time, or that of his son and successor, Djoser, is this great mud brick mastaba at Beit Khalaf, just north of Abydos, which possibly is the tomb of his wife, Queen Nemat-Hap, who is both known from his own tomb in various ceilings, named as the mother of the king's children, but also is known from her son's context as well. So she is very much the bridge between the second and third dynasties. And it indicates that the choice of changing dynasty isn't fully clear. Dynasties are broadly equivalent to our modern royal houses of Windsor, Hohenzollern, and stuff like that. But it's not always that you get a clear family division. And here it seems quite clear that the division is simply between a father and son's reign. The division may, however, be because of the importance of the ending of the civil war, and that the beginning of a third dynasty was to mark out that there was a new beginning happening. Oh, and here we have a planned section of this great tomb at Beit Khalaf. Djoser's son and successor, Hetep's Hasekhemwy's son and successor is King Djoser. And the importance of his name is not only shown by the fact that he started a new dynasty for him, but also that in one of the surviving ancient king lists, his name is written in red ink, again marking it all out as a new beginning. Under him, we find some of the earliest temple reliefs surviving, a few fragments here from Heliopolis. And these indicate that the writing of the Egyptian language has taken great steps forward. We have now got the kind of texts and connected sentences and so on we are getting later on. And within a century of this, we've certainly got examples of texts in language which is still being used on occasion in Roman times. So important point of departure here. And also here from the same temple at Heliopolis, we have got a colossal figure of the king with his wife and daughter shown at his feet. As with Egyptian art throughout Egyptian history, the size of the individual is commensurate with their relative status. The building of the step pyramid is one of the great points in Djoser's reign, and it marks a number of different things. Well, first of all, the very fact there were the resources to build this huge stone monument suggests that the dislocation of the civil war is over. We also see that there is a step ahead forward in the conception of the royal tomb. Rather than having a great enclosure and then the tomb a couple of kilometers away, and we also actually find that at Saqqara as well in the Second Dynasty, there are some enclosures associated with the royal tombs of the Second Dynasty there. The two elements are brought together in one place, so that therefore in the center was built initially a low square structure, possibly a regularized form of the tumulus, which probably topped earlier tombs, which was then extended and became a stepped pyramid eventually, with the king's tomb underneath it. So it's in the center of a great enclosure, very similar to the enclosures at Abydos, but this case made entirely of stone. Indeed, the entire monument is made of stone. It's the first large monumental stone structure in the world. Inside the enclosure are various buildings, or just say dummy buildings, and they're dummies of structures originally built with perishable materials. And that then also seems to tie in with what's going on at Abydos. Very little has been found inside these enclosures, suggesting any buildings were temporary structures of wood and plant material, exactly the sort of thing which is eventually found here. And here we see that the panelled exterior, which we've seen at Abydos, and is also found around the same sort of time at in Mesopotamia. And here we have the pyramid itself. This is the area of the very first phases. And luckily, because of damage to the pyramid, it's possible to trace it from this original low square structure to ultimately a six-stepped pyramid. Quite what the meaning of the six-stepped pyramid is unclear, possibly a stairway to heaven, but there are no texts which really help us on this. The king was buried underneath the center of it. The burial chamber was constructed at the bottom of a deep pit, which was later backfilled. The burial chamber itself is entirely destroyed, apart from a few blocks from the walls and ceiling, and these stars were part of the ceiling of it. And under the floor was this granite kist in which the king's body was placed. But say everything above it, say including the burial chamber, has long since been destroyed. This is looking down the entrance passageway which would have led into that chamber, which would have been about over the top of this. There are there's panels of faience tiles have been found in rooms underneath the pyramid, and these are the earliest decorated rooms underneath any royal tomb, apart from that painted tomb at Hierakonpolis. And indeed, they wouldn't be any more decorated features underneath any royal tombs again until the end of the 5th dynasty. So very important as sort of intermediate things here. And also we even have reliefs of the king carrying out the Jubilee ceremonies down here as well, which again is very unusual. According to the later tradition, a major associate of Djoser was the official Imhotep, and he later became a truly legendary figure. It wasn't until 1926 that his existence was confirmed in our contemporary monument by discovery of this statue base, which is a statue of the king, but also has an inscription of this official Imhotep, who was later sort of attributed the invention of building in hewn stones and effectively architect of the step pyramid. It's very unusual to have an official's name and titles on a royal statue. So all this underlines the fact that Imhotep was a really, really important person under Djoser, and therefore later legend wasn't over assessing him. When he became a divinity, and this is a votive bronze statue of him. The question of the tomb of Imhotep has been an open one ever since the reality of his existence was identified. And although we can't be certain, this tomb at Saqqara, called S3518, rather prosaically, may be his tomb. It certainly dates to Djoser's reign. A seal impression of Djoser was found. Unfortunately, nothing of its decoration or the name of its owner was recovered. The reason we think this could be the tomb of Imhotep, however, is because it has an unusual orientation which it shares with the step pyramid. The step pyramid is slightly is oriented away from north-south, which is what normal for pyramids, and same is true for this tomb. So it's possible, let's say, that therefore this almost unique orientation, and also a prime location as well. You can see the views from here may indicate this was the tomb of Imhotep. After Djoser, we have a king called Sechem-Ket, who is known from reliefs in the Wadi Maghara in the mining areas of the Sinai Peninsula, and also from his unfinished pyramid at Saqqara. It was only barely begun, only probably the first step was constructed, And here we see, and also we can see the parts of the unfinished enclosure wall and the entrance to the substructure. When excavated in the 1950s, it still contained some funerary material and also a sarcophagus which was sealed closed. However, there was no mummy in it, which has led to head scratching, which continues on at the present day. But amongst things found in the tomb were some jewellery, these gold bangles, for example, and this little offering list, which also includes one of the king's other names, the Nebti Djoser, which is rather useful because this allows us to tie him in with the later king lists, which don't use Horus names, but for this early on, they often use Nebti names. So here is Djoser on the Turin king list, which is probably the same as the abbreviated form Teti in the Abydos list and Djoser Teti on the Saqqara one. However, after him, it all gets a little bit problematic, just as it did in the Second Dynasty. Manetho's list from the 3rd century BC has no fewer than 8 kings for the dynasty. But the earlier lists have a maximum of 5, and they don't agree on many things. 2 of them have a king called Nebkar before Djoser. We know for certain that Djoser directly followed Kharsekhemwy, so Nebkar can't be at the beginning of the dynasty. And the Saqqara list actually puts him after Sekhemkhet or Djoser T. So that's all problematic. Also, we find in the Abydos list a name of Sejes, and also in Turin king list the name Hujefa. And Hujefa, if you remember, was what was used, had been mistaken for a name in the Second Dynasty king list, when it actually meant lacuna or gap in data. And we think that Sejes also means gap in data. So it looks as though even the ancient Egyptians themselves weren't really 100% clear what was going on in the latter part of the 3rd dynasty. Where there was another civil war, we have absolutely no idea. All we can do is trace a few apparent royal mortuary monuments and a few contemporary inscriptions. So we have this king Sarnachti, who's also found in inscriptions in the Sinai Peninsula, near those of Sekhemkhet. There's also some of Djoser there as well, suggesting mining expeditions being carried out during the 3rd dynasty. We have got no tomb with his name attached to it. It's possibly a monument which is here at Abu Roash, in the northern part of the cemeteries which are associated with Memphis. And it's not been looked at since 1930, but one can still, there's still some traces of it visible above ground, all made of mud brick. There's a massif here which could possibly be the remains of a mud brick pyramid, and also the excavation in the 1930s traced part of a mud brick enclosure wall. Now the mud brick might give you pause, hang on, hasn't things just, didn't Djoser move to building in stone? But there is a brick pyramid datable to the end of the 3rd dynasty. So it looks as though that during this period, there's still a certain amount of experimentation, give and take and so on going on as to what materials are to be built. It's also possible that if there are problems going on in Egypt, building something of mud brick is probably easier. And this has actually been built very much closer to the Nile than most other royal mortuary monuments, to make it easier to get at the mud brick, presumably. Another tomb probably should be datable to this period is the layer pyramid at Zoet al Arian, possibly owned by a king called Khabar. No, this is not actually found in the pyramid, but in a tomb about half a kilometre away. So it's not really certain that this is actually correct attribution or not. Khabar is otherwise completely unknown, but architecturally the pyramid really has to fit soon after Sekhemkhet's. So this can, I think, be quite confidently said to be a 3rd dynasty pyramid, but exactly where its owner fits in is all a bit more of a problem. This stela in the Louvre belongs to a king called Lahorus Kar-Hejet, a name which is otherwise unknown, but may be the same as a king whose personal name was Huni, who appears both on the king lists and also in a contemporary tomb as well. And Huni's mortuary monument is possibly this one. This is the, well, it seems most likely to be this one, the brick pyramid at Abu Raish, not that far away from the tomb which I potentially identified as that of Zanakti. This is as it is today, and you would say it probably doesn't look much like a pyramid. This is what it looked like, however, in the mid-19th century. And surveying work has shown us that what happened here was that the builders used a natural rock knoll as the core for a gigantic step pyramid. And if you extrapolate from the various cuttings and also from these 19th century representations, it looks as though this could, had it been completed, have been one of the largest pyramids ever built in Egypt, but built of mud brick, which is really quite an interesting factor. And just a repeat of one of those, and also another view from the 19th century. The reason why we think it could well be Huni's is that the form of the interior is such that it's not something which you find earlier on in Egyptian history, and don't really find that kind of layout after the first couple of reigns of the fourth dynasty. So really the only place this can go is at the end of the third dynasty, which is where we also have Huni, who is known from a later folk tale also to be the last king, not just to be the last king on the king list, but there's actually an explicit statement in a later document. So all of which ties in the idea that this is the last king of the third dynasty. And he is followed by Snefru, the founder of the fourth dynasty. And with the foundation of the fourth dynasty, everything changes. No longer do we have to scratch our heads over the ordering of kings. Okay, there's a couple of minor issues, but basically it's all known. Prior to Snefru, we only have a handful of royal officials known, but under Snefru, we have a number of them. And when we move on to his son and successor, Khufu, we know the names of pretty well the entire government, and we can start tracing the history of various official offices and so on. So the world changes fundamentally under Snefru. In many ways, the same sort of way that the world seems to have changed under Djoser as well. And I think with the accession of Snefru, one can certainly say that the sort of prototypical era of Egyptian history is over, and the era of the first pharaohs has well and truly come to an end.